Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff, with Eleanor Goldfield. In this segment of the program today, we welcome back Dr. Nolan Higdon. He is a lecturer at UC Santa Cruz Merrill School of Education. He is also the author of numerous books, including The Anatomy of Fake News, and also an author of numerous op-eds and academic articles. This week, we're bringing Nolan back on the program to talk about a piece that he and I did for Press Freedom Day, which was May 3rd. The press freedom clock is tick-tocking. So obviously, we're going to talk a little bit about press freedoms, social media, but we're also going to do that on the backdrop of the way in which the corporate press has been framing student protests as the spring semester 24 comes to a close, a tumultuous close. And we're also going to get more historical perspectives on sort of what's been happening and relate it to the way corporate coverage is happening with Israel, Gaza, and more. Nolan Higdon, welcome back to the Project Censored Show.
Thanks for having me, Mickey. And what's up, Project Censored Universe?
It is always good to have you on, and I know it's a busy time for us at Project Censored. We're judging, and you're a Project Censored judge. We're looking at our top 25 for the next book. And, well, I can tell you there's quite a bit in the book this year, analytically, about Gaza and the Israeli attacks in response to Hamas's October 7 attacks. So, Nolan, let's start here by talking about press freedom. And of course, this is on the backdrop. It's difficult to talk about press freedoms without talking about the onslaught against the people of Palestine, particularly the journalists that have been killed there. Just recently, we saw, the index on, the Press Freedom Index was released, and the United States had slid to 55th. I think it's down about 10 spots from the year before. And Israel was 101st on the list. I mean, these are not sterling figures. These are not great places for press freedom. Yet, when we see and we talk about the United States and press freedoms and the freest press in the world, and Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East, I think people get a different impression that perhaps the press is freer than it actually is. Maybe you can comment on some of the state of our free press, Nolan Higdon.
Yeah, I think it's such an important time for me to be on the Project Censor radio show. I think the current climate just illustrates the need for organizations like Project Censored. And I don't say that just necessarily to celebrate the project. I say that because I'm quite fearful about the trends we're seeing all around us. And there seems to be very little concern about the amount of censorship that's taking place in the United States right now, regardless of how you feel about this conflict, whether you're pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, choose your label. Banning whole social media platforms, threatening to steal 501c3 statuses from nonprofits, threatening to blacklist students who participate in protests, shutting down student groups like that was done by DeSantis in Florida. Sending in the police to remove people who are using their constitutional rights. If this was happening in any other country, we would be mocking that country as being backward or undeveloped or any other negative connotation term we would use. Yet we're sitting here listening to people in positions of power, people in positions of privilege, lecturing us on why the suppression of civil liberties is needed. And I think the extra sort of shocking part of all this is we're talking about events that are going on in a different part of the world. This nation is being divided and shedding a lot of its rhetorical principles to civil liberties over something that's going on internationally because we can't disentangle ourselves from it. So it's quite a frightening time, but I take comfort in the fact that there are organizations like Project Censored are out there who do have platforms like this, who will allow us to talk openly about some of these critical issues. But I got to say, Mickey, increasingly, yourself and Project Censored, you have fewer and fewer allies, it seems like, as I look around the country at this time.
It's quite disturbing, the trends that we're seeing. And then, of course, as you well know, when we see these efforts to purge or deplatform or demonetize, beyond shadow banning, literally kicking people off of platforms, or in this case, disappearing an entire platform altogether, allegedly because it does data harvesting and it can get sensitive information. But all the platforms do that. This one just, however, happens to be owned by a Chinese company. It's called TikTok, right? And of course, we are on TikTok along with lots of other people. Nolan, can you comment on just on the face of it, the absurdity of singling out this platform by Congress? And Biden has signed on to this law that purportedly will ban TikTok in some months, some 9 months. Can you talk about that, Nolan Higdon?
Yeah, I think the important part I'm going to take here is there's a lot of critiques about social media, and Mickey and I have written tons of books about them, articles about them. I've made a career out of criticizing social media platforms, so I'm not some big defender of this, what I would call toxic industry. And if the government wanted to seriously regulate the industry for the purposes of making it better for citizens, things like, trying to get rid of screen addiction or stop some of the mental health trauma we're seeing from young people, et cetera, I would be totally open to those kinds of regulations. But people need to understand, this bill doesn't do any of that. This bill is aimed at targeting TikTok because TikTok is a foreign-owned platform, and it's not just that lawmakers are xenophobic. The reason why it's foreign ownership plays a critical role here is that gives very little leverage to the United States to dictate how the platform moderates its content. So US owned companies, if they won't play ball with the federal government, the government says like, well, maybe we can make a government contracts disappear. Maybe we can regulate you. Maybe we can raise your taxes, i.e. you play ball or we will make your life hell. They can't really do that with TikTok. And so when TikTok continued to allow content to be published that challenged the US narrative on numerous things, but Israel in particular, lawmakers moved to ban the platform. And I want to make it very clear, initially, a lot of us thought the timing was odd, right? That they're taking down this platform in the midst of this war. And myself, one of these commentators who said, like, I think they're doing it because of the Palestine content. Well, that's now been confirmed. Anthony Blinken and Senator
Yes.
Mitt Romney have both basically confirmed that in the last week. So this is straight up just censorship. Again, if this was happening anywhere else in the world, we would all be mocking this country and demanding more freedom and rights. But instead, here, we're pretending like we're having this sophisticated debate about how much censorship is allowed.
Well, the only democracy in the Middle East, Israel, just banned Al Jazeera.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I don't see a lot of mockery going on in terms of Israel banning Al Jazeera, just like how RT America was memory hold here by telecom, not the government, but censorship by proxy. And that's exactly what you're talking about here, Nolan Higdon, is you're talking about the fact that the US government still has a lot of power and authority to indirectly influence US based companies, but not necessarily a company like TikTok that is actually part of a Chinese company called ByteDance. And you just mentioned the Mitt Romney and Secretary Blinken conversation, where they literally admitted that the reason that they were censoring it was because of the Gaza protests. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's they say that in the open, which also again speaks to why I say that the culture has some serious problems. That lawmakers can openly say they're censoring content because they don't like the views being expressed, and we all just move along our merry way, wait for the 4th of July to come up so we can talk about how free of a country we are and committed to free principles. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd.
Well, it's also absurd that we have one of the candidates for office who's on trial right now from the courtroom. Um, that is openly said. We said this earlier in the other segment with Andy Lee Roth and Seth Stern. We have one of the candidates that's openly said we should be jailing more protesters. We should be jailing journalists. We should be attacking journalists. This is the same candidate that called the press the enemy of the people. Of course, multiple choice. Which candidate are we talking about? That would, of course, be Donald Trump. But all of the things that we're talking about right now, Nolan Higdon, are happening under the Democrats and Joe Biden. So, I mean, again, not to say that there's not a difference. There's clearly a difference between some the parties on certain issues, but this is Biden that's overseeing this kind of censorship. It was Biden that got caught messing around backdoor with Twitter in the Twitter files. It was the Biden administration that started the Disinformation Governance Board. Your comments?
Yeah, this is I mean, this is why I and so many others for 40 years have been saying this lesser of two evils is just nonsense. You still end up with evil. Let's not forget, at the end of the Trump administration, the promise of Biden and the Democrats was, look, we're going to return to normal. You're going to be able to go back to brunch. You're not going to be on 24-hour news cycles. Look what's happened in the last 4 years. I mean, the Trump era is nothing to wish we were back in. I don't wish we were back in the midst of COVID or watching this, fascist tweets every single morning. But Biden, oh my God, look at the way the state of the world is right now. And this is why the lesser of two evils argument doesn't work. As you point out, we could go down the litany of list of things during the Trump era or the Biden era or the Obama era, the Bush era. It's the same suppression of civil liberties, the same extension of the war state. And you have to pick a candidate who's radically has a different view of the world. You can't keep ping-ponging back and forth between red and blue and promising people, well, this time it's going to be different. We're going to hold the feet to the fire, as they said with Biden, or Trump's a new kind of Republican. He's changing the party. It's the same stuff, the same outcomes. We just need to stop having this nonsensical conversation.
Yeah, indeed, we would hope that we would, but there's another issue that came out, not just with press freedom. I mean, the U.S. was 45th, now down to 55th. Israel was 97th, now they're down to 101st, just banned Al Jazeera. There's another index that we talked about, the Economist Intelligence Unit, which actually currently labels the United States, quote, a flawed democracy at 29th place in its democracy index for 23, just ahead of Israel at 30th place. So it doesn't roll off the tongue. We're 29, right? Or, I mean, it definitely flies in the face of the rhetoric you were just talking about the 4th of July and the hoopla of the election year. So it's important to remember that we ourselves have a lot of work to do here in the United States, and we need a free and vibrant press in order to understand what's happening. But what we're getting from the corporate media about almost any issue, from the election to Israel to Ukraine, Russia, particularly, is, hey, this is it. This is what's happening. This is the narrative. These are the things that we're going to be talking about. And the Democrats did just wheel out Hillary Clinton again to badmouth students as being idiots and people that don't know anything. And just like her basket of deplorables comment going back to the 2016 election, she's saying that people just need to get over themselves, even if a majority of people in both parties don't like the candidates. And so that flawed democracy status from the Economist Intelligence Unit, that's on the backdrop of all the things you're talking about. And the lack of press freedoms is deeply connected to that. Nolan Higdon.
Yeah, I mean, luckily, Hillary Clinton has like the level of popularity of something like COVID, so I don't think she's gonna have too much of an influence. But yeah, there was a great book released about a decade ago called "Undoing the Demos" by Brown, and in it, they talked about how since the 1970s, and we wrote about this too in United States of Distraction, Mickey,
Mhm.
the nation underneath this sort of neoliberal regime has privileged economic efficiency, economic outcomes over everything else. And what Brown wrote about in the demos is when you focus solely on economics for everything, right? We try and turn everything into a branding exercise, or we turn college into trying to make money. What's lost in there is democracy. We no longer focus on democracy as an outcome. Instead, we want economic outcomes. And I think you're seeing that, and this was written about 10 years ago. I think you're seeing the warning of Brown and others come to fruition, that democracy is dissipating in real time. And half of the nation seems to understand it when someone like Donald Trump is elected. When a reality television star billionaire is elected, they realize democracy is in trouble. But for some reason, as soon as Team Blue's in office, they forget it again, despite the things we're seeing with the suppression of civil liberties and America's press rankings falling. And this is what I mean about the more sophisticated conversation. You can't red and blue your way out of this. The very principles and policies these parties fight for are coming at the expense of democracy. And I think what I hear the two of us saying, and I know we've certainly written in books, but are saying here today, you have to privilege those principles, those basic aspects of democracy over the economy if you want to have a democracy. That means standing up for freedom of the press. If they're going to report things that drive me nuts about Gaza, Israel, that's fine, but they should have every right to do it, and I'll protect them to do it. Ditto with free speech, ditto with right to peaceably assemble, ditto with student protests. I don't care if I agree or disagree with them. We need to have those to have a democracy.
Indeed, and that's happening all over the country, protests and counter protests, and actually in echoes of Kent State from 54 years ago, but not just the 68 convention in Chicago that might be coming up on a redux, but 54 years ago, we saw the National Guard called out to quell campus protests against Nixon's illegal war and expansion to Cambodia and Laos. That was what the students were protesting at the end of spring semester in 1970, when the National Guard came and shot 4 students, killed them, and wounded 9 others. The reason we're bringing that up now in the sort of, again, the echoes of that in the shadows of what's happening is we see now senators like Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley calling for the National Guard. wanting to call out the guard. Tom Cotton actually was saying that we need vigilante justice to throw protesters off bridges and have their skin ripped off if they glue themselves to private property or public property for that matter. The other interesting thing is that colleges are expelling students and then calling them outside agitators once they're no longer students because they're going against their rights to protest. I mean, there's a lot of things happening right now that are echoing some of these unfortunate periods in our past where we haven't learned, past this prologue, we haven't learned the importance of these protests, and we haven't learned that state violence and repression is not the answer. Nolan Higdon.
Yeah, I want to emphasize something you said there that I think I know my lefties brothers and sisters are not going to like too much here, but um, we've clearly empowered a lot of the administrators within higher education with way too much power and too little oversight, and this unfortunately goes back over the last decade in a great effort to try and make institutions more strong in combating things like sexual assault or racism on campus or hate on campus. We allow them to create processes and infrastructures that have very little democratic oversight, where the administration becomes the judge, jury, and the executioner of a lot of students. And I think the reason why that's a problem we now see with these Palestinian protests. These administrators are making decisions that are going to have critical effects on the futures of these students with very little democratic oversight from us, the public. There's nothing like a jury, independent jury that's judging these types of things. It's done all in-house. So I think this is the problem when you try and move institutions away from democratic oversight. Yeah, it may be more quote unquote efficient in terms of getting things done faster, but you're not actually getting it done better. There's not juries, there's not oversight, there's not evidence. It's up to the subjective whim of these administrators. And although it felt really great, I'm sure 10 years ago when we were talking about issues of hate crimes or sexual assault, now when they're coming down on protesters and ruining their lives, I think people are starting to see the flawed logic in giving this much power to these administrators.
And I mean, come on, the first go-to, many of these presidents at these elite colleges where people are paying tens of thousands of dollars, to attend and be on that campus. The students are being locked out of the campus. They're being treated like criminals on the campus. And the way the corporate media covers it, they always have the go-to that, once they decide that there's a protest going on or whatever, it's terrible. There was an amazing piece on CNN that can't say that very often, where JD Vance was on. And the CNN news person, mentioned to them like, "Hey, you're all against these protests and you want to get rid of all these protests. What about January 6th?" And all of a sudden it was like, "Well, hey, wait a minute, those were different." In other words, the hypocrisy on this issue is pretty extraordinary. And the corporate news framing of the protesters is that they're rabble or that they're anti-Semitic. So somehow being pro-Palestinian equals anti-Semitism, even though Palestinians are Semitic peoples. Can you help us understand this, Nolan Higdon? I'm very confused.
Yeah, I mean, from a scholarly perspective, we talk about isms, anti-Semitism, racism. You have to possess some power to be able to exert that hate. So you have to be a white person to be racist against people of color. People of color don't have the power in the society to be racist against whites, for example. So when they say that these groups are anti-Semitic, that doesn't really hold because there are many Jews who are involved in these student protests. There's also many Jews in Israel, by the way, who are protesting what Israel is doing as well. So to say all these protesters are anti-Semitic doesn't really pass the smell test. Furthermore, some folks don't even really care about the historical dynamics of the war. They simply see this as an act of genocide, and they're anti-genocide protesters. There are some folks who are two-state solutions. There are some folks who want to see all Jews out of the region. That would certainly be anti-Semitic to me. But you have a large mix of different opinions, and to put them all under one umbrella is just anti-intellectual. And I think it illustrates to me that if you put them into one term and you don't try and actually interrogate the different viewpoints, I think that means you're afraid of your own position and you don't want to argue with the positions that exist. So I think that's one critical part of it. But also, we've now had a series of studies on these protests on campuses, and it was over 99% of them were nonviolent. There is some violence. Some is from outside agitators. We've seen some protesters who oppose what these encampments are doing on campus attack them, like we saw at UCLA in very clear video and documentation. Of course, we've seen police escalate this into violence as well. So there is some violence. I'm not denying that, but it's very minuscule, and it's not coming solely from the encampments themselves. It's often coming at the encampments. And I've also been very disturbed by some of the false news stories out there that I just saw the Speaker of the House say this week, which was that there was a someone who opposed the encampments who claimed they got stabbed with a flag.
Yeah, yeah,
We saw the video. They basically
yeah.
were walking and got the flag brushed up against them. If we consider that stabbing, I've been
They
stabbed
went on
thousands of
national
times
news.
on airplanes. Every
Yeah,
time I
that
sit in an aisle seat, I get a bag rubs up against me. Is that stabbing?
Yeah, yeah. Again, it's the you're and we're also riffing around the paper of record here, right?
Yeah.
The old gray lady at the New York Times that hasn't missed the atrocity propaganda bandwagon, right? They've been leading it in many ways, and we talk about that as well in our article about what the New York Times has gotten wrong and how that has really threatened just having any kind of accurate conversation about what's happening. When you have the paper of record that people go to, to understand what's happening, getting caught with their pants down over and over again, reporting false stories, hiring biased people that have almost no journalistic credentials, and then doubling down on it. We have multiple examples that we point out in the article. I mean, that's not the fourth estate doing its job. Well, I guess if it's supposed to be a propaganda arm, that's different, but it's definitely not doing its job in the public interest. And it is further harming its own public reputation where there's already a low level of trust in media, Nolan Higdon.
Yeah, this is I think one of the horrible reactions the legacy media had to the Donald Trump era. Trump weaponized the fake news epithet, and it fed into existing skepticism about legacy media. But the response was to kind of conceal their errors versus demonstrate what good journalism is, which is you admit your errors and you offer corrections. But they've gone through this cycle of continuously trying to hide the fact that mistakes are made, and I think one of the examples right now that's on their website is they were one of the earlier reports about the sexual assaults that happened by Hamas in October of 2023 during that attack. They now have another article from another journalist on their website arguing that there's no evidence for those claims. Now, I wasn't there on October 7th. I'm not here to say the sexual assaults did or didn't happen, but the New York Times, they need to draw some conclusion there. You can't have it both ways. You can't have that it definitely happened and articles saying that there's no evidence that it happened. The Times needs to square that circle. And I think when they don't do things like that because they're afraid of admitting mistakes, all they do is give more fodder to people who want to totally disregard good journalists in this country. And there are good journalists who do work at legacy news outlets, including the New York Times.
Absolutely.
They're increasingly getting more and more difficult to find.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, Nolan Higdon, and we're running out of time in this segment. But to your point, is it a mistake, right? Or is their bias the mistake that has just laid bare, right? That the paper of record has historic, and we've covered this at Project Censored for decades. It's not just, now. They've always had a bias around Mideast politics. And since 9/11, where a lot of these crackdowns and assaults on civil liberties, were rebirthed and recodified with the Patriot Act and other things, right? We're seeing now 2 decades later the ramifications of that, the results of that sort of growing police state, surveillance state. That's all on parade right now, whether it's cracking down on the protests on campuses or disappearing independent voices from the media. So, as you and I said at the beginning, United States, a distraction with Lao Tzu. If you're not careful, you'll end up where you're heading. Are we there yet? And if so, where are we heading? And Nolan Higdon, in the last minute here, maybe some thoughts about what's happening as we go into this election year, coming summer conventions in fall, and what hope do you have that we really can platform the independent media in voices in ways that maybe we can have some meaningful outcomes to what's happening here this summer?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the hope I'm seeing is actually on these college campuses. We hear so much about how, the young people are so narcissistic and they don't care about anything. They don't care about world events. Look, they're putting their bodies on the line for something that's happening internationally. These are privileged kids. They could go get their degrees and live a pretty privileged life and ignore this whole thing. But it means something to them, and they're willing to put their bodies on the line. And that to me is an area of hope. That's illustrative of people thinking about something larger than themselves and taking action. And again, even if you disagree with what they're doing, it's just a sign of hope that they care, they're participating, they're involved in it. So I think that's great. I'm also even larger than campus protests, just the protests around the country that both, Donald Trump are feeling and Joe Biden is feeling, and the pressure that they're feeling from activists. I always take great solace in that. And I imagine at these conventions, we're going to see a lot of anger, a lot of protests against these two candidates, and hopefully, and this is the goal of protests, that at some level it moves either or both of them in a better direction for the country.
Nolan Higdon, founding member of the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas, Project Censored National Judge, author, and university lecturer at Merrill College and the Education Department at University of California, Santa Cruz. Thank you, as ever, for taking time out of your really busy schedule to join us on the Project Censored show to share your analysis with our audience. Nolan Higdon, thank you so much for joining us again today.
Thank you, Mickey, and thank you, Project Censored.